Affinity is a very infamous mechanic, famous for almost killing the game back when it was introduced all the way back in the original Mirrodin Block. However, despite the issues with the mechanic, it's still around today, continuing to get new cards printed to this day as well. Affinity is, for several reasons, a very powerful and fun mechanic that has had a very rocky history. So today we're going to be going over the mechanic, talk about how it failed, why it failed, and how Wizards eventually fixed it. Affinity is a very simple mechanic. Affinity is always attached to another category of card, such as Affinity for artifacts or Affinity for tokens. How the mechanic works is that any card with Affinity will cost 1 less to cast for each permanent you control that matches what they have Affinity for. So if you have 7 artifacts on the battlefield, a Mirror Enforcer in your hand, you'll be able to cast Enforcer for free, as its cost will be reduced all the way from 7 mana down to 0. This is a pretty simple mechanic to understand, and equally easy to understand how to build around the mechanic. You want to put as many cards of specific type on the battlefield as quickly as you can, and this is precisely how the cards were played. Before we can understand how Affinity ended up breaking the entire game, we need to go over the Affinity cards themselves, so we can understand Wizards' thought process in designing them. Frogmite is a 2/2 frog artifact creature with a mana cost of 4. It has Affinity for artifacts and no other abilities. Mirror Enforcer is a 4/4 mirror with a mana cost of 7, Affinity for artifacts, and no other abilities. The last Affinity creature to break the game was Somber Hoverguard, a 3/2 drone with a mana cost of 5 and 1 blue. It has flying, meaning it can't be blocked except by creatures with flying or reach, and has Affinity for artifacts. The last Affinity card in the original deck was Toughcast, a sorcery that costs 4 and 1 blue with Affinity for artifacts, and the effect where you draw 2 cards. There are a few big commonalities between all of these cards, mainly that they all have Affinity for artifacts specifically, as opposed to other forms of Affinity. There were many other forms of Affinity in the set, such as the Cycler card that had Affinity for certain land types, such as Razor Golem, which had Affinity for planes. The only Affinity cards from the set that ended up being so broken were the Affinity for artifact cards. To see why this is, we need to go over the rates on all these cards. If we take a look at Frogmite and Mirror Enforcer, Frogmite is a 2/2 for 4 mana. The average rate for a 2/2 is 2 mana, and you get it for any less is good. So to make the card worth playing, you have to have about 3 artifacts in play. And if you hit 4 artifacts, you can cast the spell for free, which is amazing. For Mirror Enforcer, the average rate for 4/4 is 4 mana. And as a 7 mana spell, you'll need 3 artifacts in the field to make the spell okay, and 4 to make it good. When it comes to cards like Somber Hoverguard, the card is above rate for 2 mana, and at a rate for 3 mana, meaning you'll also need about 3 artifacts to make it okay, and more to make it very good. And Toughcast compares directly to Divination, so it only needs 2 artifacts in the field to be on rate. Once it gets to 2 or less mana, the card is very powerful. Looking at all these cards, we can see the design philosophy is fairly simple. You take an effect and make it cost a little bit more than it normally would, and allow players to get it for a small discount if they have enough cards on board. If we do a bit of math, we can imagine how this would play out. Let's say you have a Frogmite in your hand. On turn 1, you play a land and then cast an artifact, making Frogmite cost 3 mana. On turn 2, you play another artifact, making Frogmite now cost 2 mana and be completely on rate. Then on turn 3, you get to do it for a discount by playing another artifact. This means it's about on rate for when you'll be playing it, assuming you play 1 card that has Affinity for a turn. If you play 2 of them, you can get a larger discount, but this can also be stopped by your opponent removing your artifacts. Of course, this applies to basically all the Affinity spells, each of them being on rate, assuming you play 1 artifact each turn, and being able to get better or worse depending on how many extra or fewer you played. This alone is a pretty good idea for a mechanic, as it gives you a big payoff, but has a reasonable downside to compensate. However, Affinity for artifacts was tuned almost entirely incorrectly, and a big reason for that were some of the other cards Wizards printed into Mirrodin. The first major factor that led to Affinity for artifacts being broken were the artifact lands. There are a total of 6 artifact lands that were introduced in the block, 1 for each of the 5 colors of mana, and 1 colorless artifact land in Darksteel Citadel. This means that you can play almost entirely artifact lands in your deck if you want to, which means you'll be playing way more artifacts and getting your Affinity for artifacts out a lot faster. Additionally, there are a lot of 0 mana artifacts, and a lot of very powerful ones as well. For a quick example, in Mirrodin Block, Wizards printed Chrome Mox and Welding Jar, both 0 mana artifacts that Affinity decks played. Welding Jar is the weaker of the two, being a 0 mana artifact that you can sacrifice to regenerate target artifact. Regeneration is a pretty old keyword, but how it works is that the next time the artifact would be destroyed, you instead tap it, remove all damage from it, which is relevant if it's an artifact creature, and remove it from combat. This allows you to play an additional artifact for no mana that could also save another one of your cards if your opponent ever tried to remove them. Chrome Mox was the most broken card. This is a 0 mana artifact with 3 abilities where, when it enters the battlefield, you exile a non-artifact non-land card from your hand, and they can be tapped to add 1 mana of any of the exiled card's colors. This card is very powerful all on its own, as getting extra mana is a great effect for any deck. But it's even more effective in Affinity decks, as it both reduces the cost of all your Affinity spells, as well as adding an actual mana once a turn. The combinations of these two types of cards, artifact lands and 0 mana artifacts, completely broke Affinity for artifacts. If we were to go back and analyze the rates of the Affinity cards with this in mind, the problem immediately becomes obvious. If you have a Frogmite in your hand, you can easily have a turn 1 that looks like Seated Synod into Chrome Mox into a 1 mana artifact creature, and then you can cast Frogmite for 1 mana. At that point, you can cast any other Frogmite that might be in your hand for free, as you now have 4 artifacts in play. Even if you don't open extremely well, if you simply play 2 artifact lands in a row and play an artifact on each of your first 2 turns, you'll hit 4 artifacts on turn 2, also allowing you to cast your Frogmites for free. The existence of the artifact lands means that your affinity for artifact count would quickly and consistently rise every turn, and you could very easily get your affinity count to twice the expected amount without really even doing anything special. The fact that you could also do far more if you happen to draw some of your 0 mana artifacts as well just made the deck even more explosive. This led to a massive issue with the standard metagame after the release of Mirrodin Block. However, before Affinity was addressed, Wizards had to address an even bigger mistake in Skull Clamp, a card that was just individually way too strong and also very good in Affinity. There were a few different decks that were running around beforehand that were competing with Affinity, but once no one could do broken things with Clamp anymore, Affinity immediately took over the format. There wasn't really any competition, and you were either playing Affinity or playing a full deck of cards specifically designed to beat Affinity. This was so bad that players started quitting the game en masse. Players had lost basically all faith in the game's designers to design balanced and fun formats. It had gotten so bad that the game's future was legitimately being threatened. Obviously, Wizards had to do something about this. In March of 2005, Wizards banned 8 cards from Affinity. All 6 artifact lands, named Ancient Den, Seat of the Synod, Vault of Whispers, Great Furnace, Tree of Tales, and Darksteel Citadel. Additionally, 2 other cards in the deck, Arcbound Ravager and Disciple of the Vault, were also banned. Both of these cards were also very strong in their own right. Arcbound Ravager is a 0/0 beast artifact creature with a mana cost of 2. It has modular 1, meaning it enters the battlefield with +1/+1 counters on it, and when it dies, you can put all these +1/+1 counters on this creature onto a target artifact creature, and it lets you sacrifice an artifact creature to put a +1/+1 counter on Ravager. Ravager was maybe the most individually powerful card of the deck, as it allows you to turn all of your artifacts directly into damage. It also made the deck very hard to block. If you were attacking with a Ravager and had a few other creatures, the Affinity player could sacrifice all their board to the Ravager and then sacrifice the Ravager itself, moving all the +1/+1 counters onto whatever you didn't block, usually getting in for lethal damage. Making this strategy even better was Disciple of the Vault, a 1/1 human cleric with a mana cost of 1 black. It is the ability where, whenever an artifact is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, you can have target opponent lose 1 life. This means that when you were sacrificing all of your artifacts to Ravager, you'd be pinging your opponent for damage each time. This resulted in a lightning fast aggro deck that was nearly impossible to stop once it got going. Interestingly, rather than ban any of the actual Affinity cards, Wizards decided to ban all of their enablers. Banning the artifact lands moved the strategy from completely overwhelming to only very good, and hitting the other best cards in the deck brought it down to just being okay. However, without the artifact lands, the Affinity cards themselves stopped seeing as much play. If we take a look into the future of Magic's card design, we can see this actually being a bit of a trend with Affinity decks. Years after ruining Standard, Wizards introduced the modern format, where all of the most broken strategies from previous years and some new ones would be allowed to see play together, but still keeping out some of the most egregious design mistakes of the earliest sets of the game. Affinity was a deck in this format for years, and is still playable to this day. However, the strategy ended up slowly moving away from playing actual Affinity cards over time. In Modern, all the artifact lands, except Darksteel Citadel, were banned, so getting too many artifacts and play at once was just a bit more difficult than it was back in Standard. So the deck slowly leaned into other artifact aggro synergies as opposed to playing actual Affinity cards, eventually trimming the final few copies of Tough Cast and playing no more Affinity cards. However, this all changed with the release of Modern Horizons 2. This set released several pieces of support for the Affinity strategy, which at this point was actually fairly weak in the Modern format after some of their best cards had been banned. The set did let the deck have a big comeback, however. First off, it printed new, slightly nerfed artifact lands in the Bridge cycle. These were artifact lands that entered the battlefield tapped, but could tap for 2 colorless mana and had Indestructible. Additionally, they printed several new affinities for artifact cards, such as Sojourn's Companion, which was basically just a better version of Mirror Enforcer, and more importantly, Thought Monitor. This is a 2/2 construct artifact creature token with a mana cost of 6 and 1 blue. It has flying and affinity for artifacts, and the ability where when it enters the battlefield, you draw 2 cards. This is basically just a Thought cast with a 2/2 flyer stapled onto it, which is amazing. The combination of these extra Affinity cards and the introduction of new artifact lands led to versions of Affinity that actually played Affinity for artifact cards you can play in the format once again. Now that we've gone over both how the deck initially broke the game and how it was once again reintroduced into the modern format, we can see the things that made Affinity for artifacts in particular so broken. For one, the existence of artifact lands make the mechanic a lot better. Other forms of Affinity were never really as problematic, simply because they didn't get to increase their Affinity count for free while also being able to manually add to it. Cards that had Affinity for other lands weren't anywhere near as problematic, because you could always know the rate at which the Affinity would start to kick in. Other Affinity cards were bounced around the idea that you could play one-ish cards that adds to Affinity a turn. Affinity for artifacts was far more powerful because it was artifacts, the card type that is the easiest to fill the board with by far. Additionally, they made another big mistake with a lot of the original Affinity for artifact cards, namely they didn't have any colored mana in their cost. More recently, we've had cards that essentially have Affinity for artifacts, such as Emery, Lurker of the Lock, which have been printed and have been fine, even if they were very powerful. The ability to cast those spells without paying any mana whatsoever can allow you to have the kind of explosive turns that Affinity is known for far more often. So, the two big rules for Affinity are to not put it into cards that only cost generic mana, and to make sure you don't put it onto something that's too easy to swarm the board with. However, not every card with Affinity for artifacts ended up being broken, as sometimes the mechanic just isn't enough to salvage a card. There were plenty of cards with the Affinity mechanic of Mirrodin that didn't end up doing too much. Blinkmoth Infusion is an instant with a mana cost of 12 and 2 blue with Affinity for artifacts, and the effect where you untap all artifacts. This is one of the most expensive spells in the entire game, and is overall quite bad. Untapping all artifacts is a potentially powerful effect, but the number of artifacts you would need for Infusion to be cheap enough that it's worth casting is far too many. There were also cards like Broodstar, a beast with a mana cost of 8 and 2 blue. It has Affinity for artifacts, flying, and the ability where its power and toughness are each equal to the number of artifacts you control. This card could be okay, but it was just a bit too expensive to consistently make work. It was also mostly irrelevant because Wizards, for some reason, printed Cranial Plating, which boosts a creature's power based on the number of artifacts you control. If you just want to hit someone for big clunks of damage, plating was just far more practical. This further cements how the exact ways in which Affinity can be broken, as these cards having colored mana in their cost is a huge downside. One of the reasons why Frogmite and Mirror Enforcers saw so much play, despite not being flashy, was just because they could be cast for free. It also shows that there's a particular breakdown for Affinity cards that pushes them over the edge, where you can start casting them for far less than you're supposed to. Any Affinity card that costs over 8 mana has ended up being too clunky, as even if your entire hand is cards that add to your Affinity count and you play all of them, you still couldn't cast them. This makes playing those Affinity cards very risky. Cards like Mycosynth Golem, a card with a nice body and a very powerful ability, cost 11 mana, and was therefore just a bit too clunky for the average aggro deck, which is what most Affinity decks tried to be. This runs into another issue with the design of Affinity cards, which is that Wizards hasn't found a way to balance it to make it work in non-aggro decks quite yet. Fairly recently, Wizards decided to bring Affinity back in a much bigger way, with several more cards receiving the mechanic, all following those broad rules, though not too many in the grand scheme of things. For a quick example, there were cards like Nahir, Forged in Fury. This is a 5/4 legendary core artificer with a mana cost of 4, 1 red, and 1 white. It has Affinity for equipment and the ability where, whenever any equipment creature you control attacks, you can exile the top card of your library. Until the end of turn, you can play that card, and you can cast equipment cards exiled this way without paying their mana cost. Nahiri is quite the fair card, though its Affinity ability is quite limited. Equipment as a card type don't really do that much by themselves. They require creatures to be put on, so you can't just fill your deck with equipment. It is worth mentioning, just a bit before Nahiri was released, they released a new mechanic called For Mirrodin. This is a mechanic where, whenever the equipment enters the battlefield, you make a 2/2 red rebel creature token and attach the equipment to it. This made Nahiri a lot more practical, as you could play a lot more equipment in your deck when they sort of functioned as creatures. Still, this didn't lead to any decks built around the card, as the payoff just wasn't good enough to justify building an entire deck around. There were quite a few cards in the Phyrexia All-Will-Be 1 that had Affinity for equipment, though not enough to really build a deck around. We did also see the return of Affinity for artifacts on the card to Plated Onslaught. This is an instant with a mana cost of 3 and 2 white. It has Affinity for artifacts and gives your entire board +2/+1 for the rest of the turn. This is a take on Inspired Charge, a card that costs 1 less to cast and has the same effect. Onslaught compares to Charge mostly favorably, though this kind of effect has almost never been good enough to see play in competitive decks, as it's very situational. There are also a number of other cards that essentially had Affinity without saying the name for quite some time, though they've all been purposefully limited to use. Angelic Overseer has Affinity for citizens, checking for one very specific type of creature. and Gate Colossus essentially has Affinity for gates. This mostly goes to show how Wizards has been extremely careful with Affinity in recent years, printing it very sparsely and with lots of restrictions. They sort of swerved into the opposite problem, which is making the mechanic just a bit too weak to see play and constructed. That's not to say the cards were completely unplayable. You would run into Gate Colossus pretty frequently on the ladder, but they weren't quite competitively viable. This is something that requires time to make work, as finding the exact power level for a mechanic can be quite tricky. Interestingly, Wizards has had a lot of success with cards that don't quite have Affinity, but have very similar abilities. Cards like Bedlam Reveler and Tolarian Terror can both reduce their cost based on the number of instant and sorcery cards in your graveyard, which is typically just the number of instants and sorceries you've played that game. These cards have seen tons of play, but never been too good in any format. It's possible that Wizards, having designed so many cards with cost-reducing abilities baked into their own costs, led to them feel more comfortable designing Affinity cards, which is why they can print cards like Nahiri, who has Affinity and a powerful ability, and know that they won't accidentally break a format. Affinity is a mechanic with a very rocky history, to say the least. Responsible for one of the greatest threats to the game to come around will get you a very bad reputation.